When I was a kid, my mom worked night shifts at a nursing home. I don't remember much of it now, but I do remember that she'd always come home late, usually around 3 a.m. By that time, my brothers and I were already asleep, tucked under the thick quilts she'd made, and the house would be eerily quiet. There was a calmness to the night, and a kind of peace that settled over the house after she'd left for work. It always felt like we were alone in the world, safe in our beds, with only the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling into the night air. But that night, I woke up around 11 p.m. I didn't know what had stirred me from sleep, but the moment I opened my eyes, something was wrong. The room felt colder than usual, the darkness deeper. I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my chest, like a loud drum, and I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that something terrible was going to happen to my mum. It was a sensation that crept over me slowly at first, like the growing chill in the air, but then it hit me all at once. My stomach twisted, and a wave of fear crashed over me. I didn't understand it, but the panic grew. My mum, she was going to die. I could feel it in every part of my being. I wasn't sure how I knew this, but it felt so real. The certainty of it, the heaviness pressing down on my chest. My eyes were wide and my breath shallow as I lay there in the dark, terrified. I began to cry, softly at first, then louder, as if my tears could somehow stop whatever horrible thing was coming. My thoughts were frantic, spiraling out of control. I prayed to God, over and over, begging him not to take my mum. I promised everything, anything. I'd be good, I'd listen, I'd do whatever it took. Just please, don't take her from me. The minutes stretched into hours, and still I couldn't stop crying. I had never felt so utterly helpless in my life. I could barely breathe through the terror that clawed at me. I could see shadows dancing across the walls, but all I could focus on was the gnawing fear that something was happening, something far worse than anything I could understand. The fear didn't make sense. It was as if I knew she was already gone, even though she hadn't even left for work yet. It was like a sudden cold certainty that had no explanation. I would wake up to the news that she was gone. It was a thought that circled in my mind, a thought I couldn't escape. I kept my eyes on the clock. Each minute dragged on painfully. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I began to calm down. My tears slowed, my breath steadied. The panic faded into exhaustion, and my body, desperate for sleep, finally gave in. I sank into the familiar comfort of my blankets, still unsettled, but too tired to stay awake. The house seemed quieter now, less menacing. As the minutes ticked by, and the weight of the night pressed down, my last thought before I slipped into sleep was that maybe, just maybe, I had overreacted. I tried to convince myself that I had just imagined it, that my mom would come home safe. But deep down, I knew that feeling. It wasn't just fear. It was a warning. I didn't hear my mom come in that night. Not at first. By the time I woke up the next morning, it was like nothing had happened. The house was full of the usual morning sounds. My brothers grumbling about getting up for school. The smell of my dad's coffee brewing in the kitchen. Everything seemed so normal. I had almost convinced myself that it was all in my head, until my dad said something. He had that serious look on his face, the one he always wore when something was bothering him. He wasn't one to talk much about feelings, but that morning he seemed different. I'll never forget the words he said. "I had the strangest feeling last night," he told my mom. "I couldn't shake it. I thought something was going to happen to you on the way home from work. I kept thinking about it for hours. I almost called you, but I didn't want to worry you." My mom looked at him, her face pale for a moment. I noticed the way her hand paused on her coffee cup, like she was gathering her thoughts. There was something in her eyes, something I didn't understand at the time. "I felt it too," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "When I was driving home, I started to get this really strange feeling. I was so sure something bad was going to happen. So I decided to take a different route than usual. I don't know why. I just did." My dad nodded, but I could see his expression change. His eyes darted over to me, and for a second, I felt like I was invisible. That eerie silence wrapped around us, and I could almost hear my heart pounding in my chest again. It was then that I realized something had happened. The strange feeling, the one I couldn't explain, hadn't been just in my head. My mom had felt it too. My dad had felt it too. They had both sensed something, just like I had, but they hadn't known what it was. They hadn't known who it was meant for. I didn't say anything. I never told them that I had the same feeling, that I had cried and prayed alone in the dark, knowing something bad was going to happen, that I'd felt it in my bones, as if the universe itself was trying to warn me. It felt too strange to share, too heavy to talk about. That day passed like any other. I didn't think much about it, not at first. But there were nights after that. Nights when I'd wake up with that same suffocating feeling. I'd lie awake, listening for the sound of her car pulling into the driveway, my heart racing with each passing minute. Some nights the feeling would come again, like a shadow creeping into my chest. But I'd try to push it away. The thought of losing her, of feeling that kind of terror again, was too much. A few weeks later, I found out something that chilled me to the bone. One of my mom's co-workers at the nursing home was involved in a car accident the same night my mom had changed her route. The accident had happened just a few miles from where my mom would have been driving. The other woman wasn't as lucky. She didn't survive. It was a terrifying, twisted coincidence. But it didn't feel like a coincidence. Not to me. Not after everything I'd felt that night. I didn't say anything to anyone, not even my mom. How could I explain it? How could I tell her that for some reason I knew? That I had known in my bones that something was going to happen? That I had felt it in the very air around me? How could I tell her that somehow I had sensed that someone was going to die, and that it could have been her? In the years since, that feeling has never quite left me. Sometimes, when I'm alone in bed late at night, I can still feel it. That same cold, creeping terror whispering, just on the edge of my thoughts. It's almost like the universe is trying to tell me something, but I'll never know for sure. And now, every time I get that feeling, I wonder, who is it for?